This is Unit 9.8, Invasive Species. So there are a lot of words that you might hear for species that have been, let's say, introduced, non-native or exotic species that did not exist in ecosystems before humans came to that ecosystem. Right, every one of these types of species has been brought outside of its historical range by humans. And these species don't necessarily have negative impacts. If you want to talk about a introduced non-native or exotic species that is having a negative impact, then the correct term to use is an invasive species. So invasive species are defined by their negative impact on an ecosystem after they have been brought there by humans. A lot of invasive species may spread rapidly. They often outcompete native species. They tend to disrupt food webs. They may have been introduced on purpose. If you read about rabbits in Australia, you would see what's going on with that. Or accidentally, which is most other species. A lot of small rodents hitched rides on boats when they came over from Europe. Other species, as we're going to see, have traveled on human vessels without the humans knowing or intending for it to happen. Successful invasive species are usually what? K or R selected. They are usually R selected species because they adapt to changing environmental conditions very well as compared to K selected species. And then successful invasive species tend to be generalists. They manage to eat food in lots of different conditions and can change their diet as necessary based on what is available. So remember why these things are true based on what an R-selected species, what characteristics they have, and generalists as well. One of the earliest environmental laws actually prohibited the transport of illegally harvested plants and animals because illegal trade in plants and animals is a large driver of introduction of invasive species. So this was banned as early as 1900. More recently is the International Treaty, the CITES Treaty, 1973. This stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. The IUCN Red List contains threatened species, and in each country, an agency is assigned to monitor import and export of these species on this list. In the US, it's the US Fish and Wildlife Service that serves this purpose. Illegal trade in exotic plants and animals is anywhere from $5 to $20 billion a year. So you can see there's a fair amount of money involved there, which is why it happens. Lots of examples here of invasive species. So consider zebra mussels. So these would hitch rides on ships in the 1980s when ships would take on ballast water to help them float higher or lower in the water as necessary to get through canals. Zebra mussels came from Europe to the Great Lakes, and they're awful because they clog pipes. We had our own mussels here in the US, but the zebra mussels have outcompeted the native mussels, and they tend to damage boats and motors because they grow so quickly. Sea lampreys came through due to the construction of shipping canals from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Previously, a lot of these lampreys just existed in the Atlantic, but not the Great Lakes. And they devastated lake trout populations. That by the 1960s, about 100 years later, there's only 2% the original population of lake trout, which had not evolved to deal with the predator that is, or the parasite that is the sea lamprey. City pigeons were introduced as domestic pets by early Europeans. They thought these birds were great, but they displaced native birds. And they carried lots of pathogens and pests. You may have heard of kudzu. It's really a Japanese plant that was introduced as an ornamental plant in the 1880s, and then planted more to combat the Dust Bowl in 1930s. However, there's no animal that really eats the kudzu, so kudzu is able to grow pretty much unfettered. You might have heard it called the vine that ate the South. It's a structural parasite on native plants. Plants, big trees and so forth, can't be as productive when they've got kudzu hanging off of them. If it grows on buildings or bridges or power lines, it will damage that infrastructure, which requires replacement. Consider also brown tree snakes. So these came from Australia or Indonesia, and they would get onto boats, usually probably chasing rats, that themselves were stowaways on boats. And certain Pacific islands, most notably Guam, um, the brown tree snake got to Guam and decimated native bird populations. Like some bird populations just completely disappeared because the brown tree snake had no predators on the island of Guam. Um, Other Pacific islands, such as Hawaii, are zealous in making sure that brown tree snakes do not come to Hawaii. So a lot of ships and planes that come to Hawaii are very carefully observed to make sure that snakes are not coming on land in Hawaii. If you want to see some data, here it is. These are animals, or I should say birds, that used to live on Guam and no longer, many of them, because of the brown tree snake. You can see how many of them from um, the early 70s down into the 80s and into the 90s just totally disappeared. Well, that is Unit 9.8, Invasive Species. Please let me know if you have any questions.